Hello everyone, this is part 7 of What If Naruto was trained by Black Zetsu, and I hope you guys enjoy this video and to like, to subscribe, to share, and check out the playlist, to see more comment down below. Now let's start the intro.
They call me a god. They call me a god. They call me a god.
Join my membership, the perks are great. It's in the description. Naruto scowled at the giant scorpion before them, briefly ruing his lack of any truly damaging, wide-scale attacks. Poisons were effective, but using them was a subtle art, and they certainly weren't capable of bringing down a beast the size of the arthropod facing them. He spared a glance at Ino, who looked ready to avoid being struck at a moment's notice, before turning to Choji. "It's all yours," he told the chubby boy. The Akamaki nodded, his hands coming together in a special seal. "Baika no jutsu," he said, and then his body size tripled. Naruto watched as Choji squared off against the scorpion, waiting for the creature to strike. Despite being Team 10's heavy hitter, the rotund boy was still a relatively passive fighter, preferring to wait until conflict was instigated before engaging in combat. As he had started to take his training more seriously, the bandit attack had apparently opened his eyes to the dangers of the real world. Naruto and Ino had come to rely on his presence to handle those threats which their abilities were ill-suited against. Granted, the blonde always tried to be prepared with something of his own, but the illusion of trust and teamwork was important. Asuma, and by extension, Jiraiya, seemed to like keeping a close eye on his activities, not to mention how his personality fluctuated and meshed with his peers. As the scorpion's tail blurred forward, Choji lifted his arms to protect his face, allowing the large stinger to deflect off his forearm braces. Throughout the months, as Choji had become more immersed and capable with his clan's techniques, he'd started adopting pieces of armor to supplement his bulk. With the additions, the rotund boy had increased both his offensive and defensive prowess, making him capable of stalling for time as his teammates worked their own maneuvers. Choji grabbed the scorpion's tail and began to rotate on the spot, lifting the arthropod off the ground and swinging it around. Naruto flipped slowly through seals as his teammate picked up speed, and when the Akamaki finally let the scorpion go, the blonde held out his hands, palms out. "Futon, Repusho," he muttered, and a rush of wind burst forth from his palms. The violent wind palm combined with Choji's toss, sending the giant scorpion soaring into the distance. With any luck, it would land on some unsuspecting Genin team and remove more opponents from the Chunin exams. Suna's Chunin exams had so far been a somewhat tense affair. The Hidden Sand had decided to host as a gesture of good faith on the part of the new Kazekage, to show that the village had nothing to hide following its betrayal of its alliance with Konoha. Despite the pretense, it was clear that some animosity still existed amongst a number of Suna and Konoha nin. Fortunately, things had remained calm. The most Naruto could see was pointed glares that reminded him too much of his early life in Konoha, but Asuma had warned the trio of genin to tread cautiously regardless. The Chunin exams were notorious as an open battleground to settle grudges, the second round especially so. They had been led and released into the Land of Wind's desert with the objective of surviving and finding their way back to Suna after 3 days. It was a test, Naruto supposed, of their fortitude and resourcefulness in a strange land, or at least a harsh one, since any Sand Genin should be well aware of what surviving in their home country entailed. Not to mention that it was a subtle way for Suna to eliminate foreign teams from the competition, if not just flat out eliminate them. If it hadn't been for Ino, they would have already been ambushed by Suna Genin. Twice. Just as Choji had become better versed in his clan's techniques, the blonde girl had also buckled down and improved upon her own specialties. Her status as a sensory shinobi had made her pivotal to Team 10's cohesiveness, capable of identifying threats before they arose and allowing them to formulate plans suited to the situation at hand. Ino's range still had its limitations, but it was leaps and bounds ahead of what most, if not all, genin participating in the Chunin exams were capable of. She walked over to Choji as the boy shrunk back to his normal size, patting him on the shoulder and congratulating him on a job well done. Naruto nodded at him in a silent display of gratitude, one which Choji accepted with a grin. Over his tenure with Team 10, the blonde had grown close with his teammates, as close as he would allow himself, anyway. It was impossible to spend months working with people and not create some sort of attachment to them, especially when they weren't actively antagonistic towards him as Sasuke and Sakura had been. But just because he'd grown comfortable around Ino, Choji, and Shikamaru didn't mean that he'd become overly expressive. Team 10 or Choji and Shikamaru, anyway, Ino tended to be rather vocal about when she felt she deserved praise or gratitude, had learned to take his quiet appreciation of the deeds in stride. None of them had taken issue with his changed personality from the academy days. Shikamaru liked him better now that he was less annoying. Choji didn't really have a preference, and Ino seemed to like thinking that he was trying to be more cool, or more like Sasuke, a thought which still sickened Naruto. Even Asuma had remained quiet on the subject, though the Jinchuriki thought that that might have been attributable to the older male not knowing his pre-genin self. Regardless, the Jonin liked to subtly try to steer the blonde away from what he thought was Naruto's committal to a career in Anbu, often recounting tales of missions with friends or his tenure as one of the prestigious 12 ninja guardians. If anything, such stories only further emphasized how impossible it was to escape the fate of being a tool, while simultaneously reinforcing Naruto's desire to break the tradition. Still, he weathered the lectures with patience, if only because Asuma had plenty of knowledge to pass on. In fact, the blonde thought that Team 10's sensei focused a bit more on his training than that of the Ino Shikacho trios, probably, he theorized, because Asuma could actually teach Naruto some of his own techniques and fighting strategies. The original members of Team 10 learned most of what they needed from their families, placing Asuma in a role closer to a catalyst than a teacher. The same wasn't true of Naruto, though, and the results showed. The fact that he could use wind ninjutsu, limited though it was for the time being, was a testament to his growth under Asuma. It chafed a little that he still required a teacher to improve certain skills, but his improvements spoke for themselves, so he bit his tongue at the hypocrisy and just went with it. He had already accepted that it would take years to get to the point that he wanted, and it was better to take advantage of any situations that arose while he could to cut down that time as much as possible. Naruto shielded his eyes from the sun and looked around, trying to spot a landmark to gauge their progress. When the vast expanse of sand was all that greeted his sight, he let out a sigh. They were approaching the evening of day 1, and the hidden sand didn't seem any closer now than it had at the beginning of the second round. Come on, he suggested, turning to Ino and Choji, we should keep moving. Both nodded in response, and the trio continued its trek north, in the direction Ino had sensed the guide leaving earlier. The sun was almost finished setting by the time they found a cave hollowed out of a small rock formation, several cacti growing outside its entrance like sentinels. While his teammates took shelter in the cave, Naruto took out a kunai and channeled chakra along its length, producing a small blade capable of slicing through anything. He cut off the spines of several cacti as close to the skin as he could manage before slicing off the naked arms and a number of fruit-bearing tops. When he felt he had enough, he collected everything from the ground and walked into the cave, where Ino and Choji were waiting in silence. Here, he said, tossing them each some dragon fruit, eat up. What's plan? Choji asked, biting into the violet-colored papaya. Rest for a couple hours, then start traveling at night. Gets us out of the hottest part of the day, Naruto explained. Unless you guys have a better idea. Choji shook his head. Ino muttered, finally a break. Yeah, you could probably use more beauty sleep, huh, Ino? Naruto joked. The kunoichi cracked her knuckles threateningly. What? She growled. Care to repeat that, Naruto? He snickered to himself. Part of the fun of having teammates was the fact that he knew just how to push specific buttons to elicit certain reactions. The teasing was one part personal amusement, one part strategy. If Asuma and Jiraiya thought he was integrating with his peers better, perhaps they would lessen their scrutiny of his actions and personality. Granted, it wasn't all a ruse. Ino's vanity was an easy and amusing topic to poke fun at, but if he could get extra benefits from their friendship, he wasn't going to complain. You wouldn't hurt the guy taking care of you, would you, Ino? Ino grumbled a little before reclining against the wall and biting into the dragonfruit rather viciously. Watch yourself, Uzumaki, she warned. Just because you got us all this doesn't mean that you can get away with pissing off a beautiful kunoichi like M. Hey, are you listening to me? Nope. He'd started tuning her out in an effort to recall what he knew about cacti. After Jiraiya had announced that he would be entering Team 10 into the Chunin exams, Naruto had started researching the environment they would be heading in. Books on the Land of Wind's botany were a bit scarce in Konoha, especially considering the completely different climates, but he had gleaned enough information from what little there was, and Zetsu, to make sure his team could survive whatever Suna threw at them. For instance, most of the dragon fruit, more correctly known as pitaya, that grew atop cacti were edible without requiring any sort of additional work. Knowing that gave his team a source of sustenance beyond what they could carry that other teams might not have. Still, it wasn't easy to absorb so much data. Studying was still an annoying task, though Naruto's hidden interest for botany, discovered and flourishing due to Zetsu's influence, gave his attention span some incentive to remain engaged in the subject. On the other hand, it was also one of the more probable reasons his exploration into human anatomy hadn't gone anywhere. In that vein, the bodies of the bandits he'd taken had yielded no new data. He couldn't establish times of death for them, and since he wasn't a doctor or medicnin, he was reluctant to dissect the bodies and attempt to perform autopsies. Not only was the idea a bit grotesque, but unlike with his study of plants, the blonde had no idea what to look for, no basis to compare the results to. Disposing of the bodies after he determined he couldn't glean anything from them hadn't been difficult, though he shuddered a little at the memory. Still, when it came to self-preservation, Naruto was willing to put in whatever effort he had to in order to increase his chance of survival. That was why he'd learned as much as he could about the Land of Wind. He unrolled one of his scrolls on the rocky floor and placed his palm upon it, channeling chakra into it. A number of his mahogany jars appeared from within, and Naruto started picking them up and examining them with a critical eye. "What are you doing?" Choji asked, peering at the collection of jars from over the blonde's shoulder. Apparently Naruto's activities had gotten the chubby boy curious enough to walk over. "Making sure we don't die," he answered, shooting a quick look at Ino, as if daring her to comment. The platinum blonde huffed, though she didn't say anything. Behind him, Choji tilted his head in curiosity. "How?" "Well, cacti survive in the desert because they can store lots of water, right?" At his teammate's hesitant nod, he continued, "And we don't want to use up all our water too quickly either, right? So I figured that if we could draw water from cacti, then we'd make our resources last longer." When he didn't continue, Ino pointed to his jars, prompting testily, "So what's all that for?" Naruto lifted up another jar, uncorked it, sniffed the contents, then put it back down. He'd stopped labeling some of his jars on the off chance they fell into the wrong hands, and figuring out what contained what took a little bit of sleuthing. A frown marred his features. Ino was a good friend most of the time, but she had little appreciation for some of the complexities associated with Naruto's art, probably because she'd been an unwilling test subject of his poison, and her patience with some of his antics was a bit limited. It's not that simple. Truthfully, the entire concept was a bit above Naruto's head. It involved scientific babble that required a deeper background in biology and botany than the blonde possessed, given that most of his studies focused on medicinal and poisonous properties of plants. The basics, however, seemed to boil down to cacti having stores of water in what Naruto thought of as the pulpy mass of their insides, though it was difficult for humans to access and tasted quite poor. So, with a little bit of reluctant assistance from Zetsu, he'd come up with a mixture that could remove the cause of the bad taste, after figuring out a way to get the water out of the cacti. "Ah," he commented, sniffing another jar, "found it." Grabbing one of the cactus pieces, he saturated his chakra into the white pulp, using the same method he used to seed the ground for the attack prevention technique. Then, when he felt he'd put in enough, he pulled on his chakra, causing water to seep out of the pulp with it. By the time he was done, the cactus piece was serving as a makeshift bowl, the chakra he'd placed in the pulp forming a film similar to how he'd tried capturing the steam from his breakfast months before. "Here," he offered, tipping a pinch of the jar's contents into the liquid and handing it to Choji, "try it." Naruto kept his expression neutral as the other genin took the proffered item and drank from it. Choji was far too trusting. Granted, he hadn't added anything harmful to the water, he hoped, but if someone offered him something he'd watched that person tamper with, there was no way he'd do as his teammate had just done. Ino and Shikamaru were a bit shrewder, but neither were as paranoid as Naruto. Knowing that people were actively watching him certainly didn't help. Choji smacked his lips together. That's good. Thanks, Naruto." The blonde nodded his acceptance of his teammate's gratitude, performing the same trick on another cactus piece and holding it out to Ino. She stood up and grabbed it from him, expression relaxing as she sipped the liquid. Then she sniffed, commenting wryly, "You're such a good housewife," before resituating herself on the cave's floor. Naruto ducked his head to hide his growing smirk. That was Ino's way of admitting that she was grateful for his efforts without actually conceding that she'd been wrong. The platinum blonde had a strong sense of pride, and even their months of friendship, almost a year, actually, now that he thought about it, hadn't quite tempered the fact that she didn't like it when he was right, especially around other people. Choji patted him on the back in a consoling gesture before going to lie down. Naruto silently continued his work, sipping slowly from his own hollowed-out cactus. He stared at his reflection in the water, eyebrows drawing together in thought. One more test, he thought, not even considering that they wouldn't pass the second exam. Throw your best at me, sooner. LLL. Nice night. Bit cold for my tastes, but, yeah no, to each his own, I guess. You were brave to confront me in my own territory. Naruto shrugged, silently thinking that bravery was not the term he would use to describe what he was doing. The brave were generally revered as heroes, and the blonde wanted to be anything but a hero. Heroes were expected to do great things and died young as a result. Naruto wanted to remain as unassuming as possible to increase his lifespan. A stream of sand shot out of the gourd on Gaara's back and rushed towards Naruto. He quickly pulled out his twin senbon and channeled wind chakra through the metal, slashing through the incoming silica. The sand dispersed into a cloud of particles that remained floating around him for several moments before returning to the Suna Nin's gourd. Naruto leveled his fellow Jinchuriki with a wary look, which, as the redhead was staring at the moon and not him, went unseen. Didn't think you'd wanna attack me here. Testing your progress, Gaara intoned, to see if complying with your wish was a mistake. Rest assured, when we truly fight, it will be a clash of monsters. And you'd cause an international crisis, Naruto pointed out. Killing a participant of the Chunin exams while not during the tests, especially since the two people involved were Jinchuriki, would surely be cause for war, though factions in both the Hidden Sand and Hidden Leaf seemed to be itching for a reason to fight anyway. Not that any of that would stop Gaara from doing as he wanted. Haven't seen you in the Chunin exams. I am ineligible. Oh, that was surprising. Good job. Dead teal eyes turned to him. You presume that I was promoted based on my qualifications. It was done out of fear. His gaze adopted a hint of the madness that Naruto had been privy to during the Konoha Chunin exams. My power is unquestionable, and Suna is in dire need of every scrap of power it can manage. The Kazekage will do whatever it takes to ensure Suna's survival, even if that means promoting a demon. Keeping me out of the village on prolonged missions also allows the other villages to retain some peace of mind, even if it is a facade. Well, Naruto supposed, whatever keeps him out of my way. The fact that he didn't have to deal with his fellow Jinchuriki during the Chunin exams was a blessing, the underlying cause notwithstanding. Why did you seek me out? You fear me, Gaara stated, which is why you took precautions against me in the Chunin exams. Your fear is understandable, your presence here is not. Naruto didn't even bother denying the redhead's claim. Ah, right. I've got some info for you about a group called Akatsuki. And this should concern me. Yeah, Yasi. Hello, Naruto-kun. Naruto jumped, startled at the intrusion during his collection of fresh plants. Zetsu, you scared the crap out of me. Where have you been? You've been gone almost 4 months. Perhaps you should learn to take better stock of your surroundings, then, Black Zetsu sneered. And we were on vacation, collecting info. Both halves answered. There was a moment of silence where Naruto watched the plant man's normal eye shift to glance at his darker side, as if each half was trying to stare down the other. Why did you tell him that? He doesn't need to know how we spend our time. But he knew we were out helping him, it's only fair that he learns what we were up to. If he wasn't so inept, he wouldn't have required any assistance in the first place. Ah, standing right here. Yellow eyes gazed at Naruto unblinkingly. I can see that. You should stop being mean to Naruto-kun and tell him what we found. HMPH, I suppose it would be a waste not to. Akatsuki is a mercenary group comprised of Nukanen, Black Zetsu began, and as the former Kusa Nin spoke, Naruto focused intently on his words. knowing that the information his tutor had gotten was vital to his survival. Its services appear typical for shinobi of a hidden village, though dabbling more in combat and assassination than espionage and other mundane tasks. A bunch of different people are part of it, White Zetsu added. Black Zetsu made a noise of discontent, though he didn't interrupt. And they traveled in pairs most of the time, but we don't know how many of them there are. Most of the time, Naruto wondered. He didn't voice the question aloud, instead asking about a more pressing concern. If Akatsuki is a mercenary group, how come it's after me? We don't know, Black Zetsu admitted, but they're not just after you, White Zetsu piped in with inappropriate cheer. One of their members invaded Takagakure and attacked what we can only assume was the Nanabi Jinchuriki. To face down a shinobi who accessed such potent, demonic chakra, I admit to being impressed with the caliber of these Akatsuki shinobi. White Zetsu giggled in amusement. Light blue is a natural hair color. Naruto didn't bother pointing out that Zetsu's green hair wasn't exactly normal either. Nothing about the plant man was commonplace. What else? Zetsu shrugged. We don't know anything else. Akatsuki operates quite covertly, despite its advertised services. For obvious reasons, the hidden villages prefer not to bring attention to either the hiring of or invasions by outside forces. Sorry, Naruto-kun. Don't apologize to him. We did more than was necessary. But he might die because we couldn't figure out what Akatsuki wanted, and then all this time would have been a waste. The plant man's darker side was silent at that, and Naruto repressed his amusement at White Zetsu's victory. Wait, was that an insult? He shook his head of the thought, knowing that trying to work through the sincerity, or lack thereof, of Zetsu's words was more likely to create questions than answer them. Well, thanks for the info. Oh, he continued, reaching into one of his pouches and coming out with a scroll as a thought occurred to him, I've got something for you. With a quick application of chakra, the bodies of the bandits he tried studying appeared. White Zetsu's mouth curved upward in delight. Naruto-kun, you shouldn't have. He scratched the back of his head in discomfort. Yeah, well, there ya go. Truthfully, he hadn't yet figured out a good way to dispose of the bodies without either arousing suspicion or losing the scroll in the process, and apparently the scroll kept its sealed items in some sort of stasis that prevented decay and decomposition. Edging the scroll out from under the bodies, he rolled it up, ignoring the gleam of something in Zetsu's eye. I'm just gonna go now. The sound of Zetsu devouring the bandits' bodies followed him as he left the forest, echoing horribly in his mind. Gaara didn't react as he relayed the information Zetsu had collected on Akatsuki, leaving out the plant man's cannibalism and snarky insults. So, stated the redhead at length, you wanted to warn me about an organization collecting the Jinchuriki. Why? He asked at Naruto's nod. The blonde shrugged. Felt like it. Maybe you're super strong or whatever, but I don't think you should be ambushed like the Taki Jinchuriki. Sand swirled around the Sunanin in a thin stream. I cannot be ambushed, Gaara intoned matter-of-factly. Your warning is unneeded. Now leave. Knowing that it was unwise to press his luck with Gaara's temperament, and done delivering his message, the blonde left the rooftop silently, jumping to the street below and wandering back to the hotel with hands laced behind his head. If Akatsuki was after the Jinchuriki, all the Jinchuriki, Naruto certainly had no intention of going down without a fight. And if manipulating his fellow demon container into doing his dirty work for him saved him some effort, well, he had no compunctions about doing so. Gaara would be targeted at some point, and with the redhead's insatiable thirst for conflict and murder, the challenge that Akatsuki would pose would, hopefully, lure the redhead into, hopefully, taking care of the mercenary group before it became Naruto's problem. It was manipulative as hell, it hinged on a lot of hypotheticals, and Gaara was rather resistant to serve as Naruto's unknowing tool, but the blonde would try whatever method he could to get the Ichibi Jinchuriki to work for his cause. A clone stepped out from the shadows and deposited a ceramic jar into the real blonde's hand before dispersing in a puff of smoke. Naruto tossed the weapon up and caught it, thinking about how Gaara's idea of being ambushed was far too narrow. He placed the jar containing a potent sleeping agent back in its pouch and continued walking back to the hotel. Gaara was a useful pawn, but if the redhead didn't think he could be ambushed, and having a shadow clone utilizing the Shinra Bansho beneath the Sunanin on the chance he needed to be subdued was definitely an ambush, he wouldn't be nearly as much of an asset as Naruto hoped. Ah well, he figured, not like I should rely on him anyway. LLL. Congratulations again on making it to the third stage of the Chunin exams. Here you will have the opportunity to showcase your skills to the future clients of your villages. Addressing them was the new Kazekage, Gaara's father's successor. Naruto remembered. A woman with pupil-less brown eyes and forest green hair tied up in a bun. A pair of, what the blonde could only assume was dyed, orange tresses framed her angular face. Her serious expression was matched only by the monotone in which she spoke, and Naruto wondered whether she was just acting that way or if her personality truly was as flat and boring as her voice. During the course of these exams, the qualities expected of a Chunin have been tested, continued the Kazekage. Strategizing and leadership, survival in a foreign environment, teamwork. To simulate combat in the field, the final exam will test the abilities of your team to neutralize an opposing team. Sometimes, as Chunin, you will have to make life and death decisions between either saving your teammates or completing a mission. She paused for effect, allowing the ominous meaning of the statement to linger. As such, whoever remains conscious from the winning team will be promoted. So even if your team wins, you can still lose if you're not awake, huh? And if you don't work together to take down all the enemies, you might get outnumbered. Another test promoting both teamwork and individualism. Well, Naruto was used to those. Now, the first match will now commence, the Kazekage announced. Team 10 from Konohagakure and Team 2 from Takagakure remain in the arena. Everyone else should exit towards the surveying balcony. Naruto cracked his knuckles as everyone but the two teams left. The arena was a circular construct with a floor composed of square tiles and curved earthen walls. There was no dirt, no grass, no trees, not even a trace of the sand that starkly defined almost the entirety of the Land of Wind. They were being tested on pure combat potential, relying solely upon the skills they had and not how effectively they could use the terrain. It wasn't the type of fight Naruto particularly excelled in, given that the fights he preferred were normally over before the opponent knew he was there, but he also had enough tricks up his sleeve to feel confident in Team 10's victory. He stretched his arms in the air, turning his head to the right to glance at Ino and Choji and purposefully blinking once when they caught his gaze. Neither responded, but the blonde could tell by the way they shifted just slightly that they'd received the message. The proctor, a man Naruto vaguely recognized as the tall Sunanin who had fought the proctor back in Konoha's Chunin exams, glanced dispassionately at both teams. Begin, he said, jumping away to give them space to fight. Two of the Taki Nin flipped through seals, producing two jets of water that split the members of Team 10 apart from each other. The apparent leader of the waterfall genin used a similar technique to drag moisture from the air, forming a deep blue sword with jagged edges, which he immediately slashed at Naruto with. The blonde's hands dipped into his pouch, withdrawing his senbon and crossing them together to counter the attack. He took the momentary stalemate to glance over at Ino and Choji. Both of his teammates seemed to be holding their own in combat, despite the intentions of the opposing team to take him out individually. It was smart of the Taki Nin to separate them. Team 10, after all, was a group focused heavily on teamwork, even more so considering the fact that neither Choji nor Ino looked particularly suited to being shinobi. It was a common misconception, but Naruto was confident that Ino and Choji could either hold their own until he took his opponent out or end their battles by their own merit. There was no noise as his senbon continued to clash with the Taki Nin's solidified water sword. After so much practice against Tenten and Asuma in which metal resounded against metal, the lack of any sound was almost disappointing. Sparring constantly with Asuma and Tenten gave him a fair idea of how to defend against the waterfall genin. Takagakure Ru, Chomizukiri no Yaiba. More water condensed along the sword, increasing the blade's length as the Taki Nin thrust it at him. The extended reach surprised Naruto from his reverie, nullifying his blocking stance and forcing him to dive to the side to avoid getting skewered. It still sliced through his right shoulder, eliciting a hiss from him as he came to a kneeling position on the tile. Stupid. Pay attention. Looking for a momentary distraction, he tossed his twin senbon at the Taki Nin and used the opportunity to reach for one of his ceramic jars. Slamming it on the ground a little in front of him, the Jinchuriki used chakra to propel himself into the air, forming seals as he did so. Kazenagare no Jutsu, he thought, cheeks puffing out before expelling a stream of wind at his previous location. White manchineel gas exploded out of the broken jar and was immediately caught up in the blonde's wind stream technique, settling like a cloud over the Taki Nin. He hollered in pain as the blinding vapor took effect. Through the white haze, Naruto could make out his opponent forming hasty seals. A moment later, a slight drizzle rained upon the cloud, a strategy the blonde assumed was an effort to wash out the gas. He shook his head in an almost sympathetic gesture. Mixing water and the manchineel gas was like trying to douse a fire with oil. It was guaranteed to exacerbate rather than cure the problem. Sure enough, the Taki Nin's yells soon escalated in tandem with a mixture of flailing and scratching. Naruto decided to put the boy out of his misery, withdrawing a handful of senbon laced with knockout poison and hurling them into the dissipating gas cloud. In a matter of seconds, the Genin's prone form could be seen lying on the ground, angry red splotches covering his body. Naruto let out a small noise of approval, pleased to see the fruit of his labors. Then he turned to check out his teammates' progress. Choji seemed to be holding his own, using his partial multi-size technique to withstand and absorb most of his adversary's attacks. A short distance from him, Ino's lithe body was dancing around the third Taki Nin, dodging everything with her Muso Bato-Ru, using kunai to try to land a more debilitating blow. Naruto sighed to himself, debating what to do. They still needed to knock out the remaining two Taki Nin in order to pass the test, but the experience of fighting other shinobi, a rather uncommon occurrence on the missions they'd performed over the past several months, would be good for Ino and Choji to better understand their individual strengths and weaknesses against supposed equals. And they should be able to fend for themselves without relying on him or Shikamaru, just in case, just as he had trained to depend on his own skills. On the other hand, Ino wasn't a combat-oriented shinobi, and she would have no problem giving him grief for leaving her to her own devices. Walking over to the felled Taki Nin and picking up his dropped senbon, he pocketed them and then grabbed two smaller ones, moving closer to where his fellow blonde was dodging her opponent. He studied their rhythm for several moments before releasing one needle after the other as practice with Tenten had drilled into his head. Both struck home, one burying itself in his calf, the other in his neck. The Genin stumbled briefly, affected by the muscle-paralyzing toxin tipping the senbon, and Ino took the moment to form the specialized seal of her clan. Her consciousness shot into his, and after another couple seconds, the Taki Nin slumped to the ground, forced into unconsciousness. The polite applause of the crowd caught Naruto's attention, and he glanced at Choji to find the Akamaki's opponent out cold. We won, he thought, allowing himself a small smile. Ino stalked up to him. I didn't need your help, she huffed. I had that guy exactly where I wanted him right before you interfered. Shouldn't you just be glad we won? Duh, she sniffed, but it's the principle of the thing. I'm not some damsel in distress that needs rescuing. Naruto sighed, causing Choji to shoot him a sympathetic look. Yelled at for helpin', probably would've gotten yelled at for not helpin', there's just no winning with her. Shikamaru's right, women are troublesome. The winners are Akamaki Choji, Uzumaki Naruto, and Yamanaka Ino of Konohagakure, stated the proctor. Now remove yourselves from the field so we can move on to the next match. They all complied, Choji withdrawing a bag of chips hidden somewhere on his person as they did so. When they were hidden from the audience's view, Ino turned to her fellow blonde and held out her hand expectantly. After a reluctant pause, Naruto silently unclasped his jar of healing salve and pulled out a roll of bandages from his pouch, handing them both over to his teammate. Shirt, she demanded, and he complied by wiggling out of the olive-colored garment, then peeling the gray undershirt over his head. Ino released an exasperated sound. You're so reckless, she told him, rubbing salve over the cut on his shoulder. He caught me by surprise. This time, Ino scoffed. Can't even handle yourself and you think we need your help, she muttered. I can handle myself just fine, I could do this myself, too, he added pointedly. Yeah, well, tough, she retorted, wrapping bandages around the wound. Maybe next time. Naruto wasn't sure whether to be amused or exasperated. Every time he got injured in practice or combat, Ino would always insist on fixing him up, and she'd always say that. It was, he'd theorized, her way of showing gratitude to him, since it was a rare occasion when she'd express such sentiment in words. Oh well, he thought, trying not to dwell on Ino's peculiarities and instead choosing to revel in his pending promotion. He slid his shirts back on and took the proffered medical items from Ino, walking side by side with her up to the viewing balcony. I'm Mac in progress. LLL. Naruto tossed his new weapon into the air, watched it with a careful eye, and caught it on its downward path. He frowned. Despite grabbing the handle, its position felt awkward in his hand. In addition to passing on a set of earrings to Choji and Ino, as was tradition, Asuma had presented Naruto with a pair of hunting knives as a gift for making chunin. The hunting knives, he'd explained, were better than the blonde's senbon or kunai for utilizing wind chakra in combat, and the fighting style they utilized was a bit closer to the one Asuma used than trying to reinvent a style based on how Haku had fought in the Land of Waves. Naruto had initially tried to reject the gift, but Asuma had insisted that it was tradition for a teacher to give his students gifts whenever they were promoted to chunin, so he'd stopped protesting. Besides, Asuma had given him something pretty useful. It would have been a mistake not to make use of the knives. Though simple, the blades possessed a sort of elegance that Naruto could appreciate. 18 inches from tip to hilt, the foot-long blade was sleek steel with a slight curve in the last few inches that provided a perfect edge for poison. The handle was smooth mahogany, long enough for the blonde to grow into the knives as he went through adolescence. Finding a balance was weird. They were forged a little differently from kunai, and way differently from senbon, but the newly minted chunin felt that he'd be able to work out the kinks soon enough. Tenten, at least, would be pleased to try and help him fully understand the new weapons. He flipped his grip on the weapon, turned, and threw it at a tree 10 feet away. Naruto-kun, you almost killed us. The Jinchuriki blinked as his tutor melded out of the tree his knife was sticking out of. Ah, sorry, Zetsu, didn't see you there. I didn't mean it. So you say, Black Zetsu remarked at the same time White Zetsu said, or, it's okay then, Naruto-kun. No, it's not okay, Black Zetsu corrected testily. I do not wish to die because of his incompetence. Well, I just made chunin, Naruto told him, and even as he tried to withhold the boasting lilt in his voice, he knew he failed, so I guess I'm not that incompetent, huh? There was a moment of silence before the plant man's darker half retorted, after everything we have told you, your pride in this meaningless accomplishment only betrays exactly how mindless you truly are. But congrats on your promotion, Naruto-kun, White Zetsu added, and his voice was so sincere that Naruto almost thought he meant it. The blonde shook his head. No, you don't get it. Now I'm one step closer to my goal. I don't get it. The feeling is mutual. Okay, well, check it out, began the teen before launching into an explanation of his revelation during Konoha's chunin exams, the conclusion he'd come to about his own skills, and the goal he'd set for himself. To his credit, Zetsu remained silent throughout the entire diatribe, listening to his pupil's thought process as the blonde had done with him countless times before. When he was done, Naruto asked, so, what do you think? Not bad, huh? After a beat, the dark sound that he'd come to associate with Black Zetsu chuckling could be clearly heard. Clever, admitted the plant man's darker side, more so than I expected. To twist the shinobi system's guidelines to suit your own ideology, there is hope for you yet. Now everything makes sense, White Zetsu added cheerfully. So, Naruto-kun, what's your next move? The blonde shrugged. Do what I've been doing, I guess. Just gotta get better with everything and take advantage of the right training opportunities when they happen. He sighed. It'll take a while, but eventually everything'll pay off. I hope. Sounds like a plan. Albeit a half-assed one. We'll see you around, then. Wait, what? He protested. Where are you going? Zetsu's yellow eye fixated on him. Adventuring. Since you know what you're doing, we're gonna go have some fun. Fear not, we shall return to check on your progress, there are many more lessons for you to stumble through, and we wouldn't want to miss bearing witness to them. The plant man's mixed laughter, both sadistically and honestly amused, echoed around him as the former Kusa-nin melded back into Konoha's foliage, disappearing to who knew where. Naruto was almost sad to see Zetsu go. Despite his twisted psychology, the plant man gave solid direction and guidance whenever he was asked, and not having him around to bounce ideas off of was a little lonely. Then again, he was a chunin now, perhaps it was time to try and figure out more on his own than leaning on Zetsu as a crutch. If the plant man was manipulating him, and he had yet to figure out if that was true, then the separation from his tutor would allow him to explore possibilities without being steered awry by any of Zetsu's personal biases, limited as they were. Opportunities abounded, all he had to do was wait for them to appear. LLL. Naruto withheld a sigh of irritation, knowing that remaining quiet was key to going undetected. The mission, annoying as it was all about stealthily gathering information, and the blonde liked keeping his personnel file clean. Personal opinions on the missions he performed be damned. Ino gave him the ready signal, prompting him to reach for one of the jars clasped around his waist. The two blondes had been deployed to Tanzaku-gai with the orders to locate the local Yakuza hideouts and find out what they were planning. Naruto's annoyance stemmed mostly from the fact that he couldn't fathom why Jiraiya would even care what the Yakuza was up to. Honestly, it wasn't like the syndicate stood much of a chance against the trained shinobi of Konoha, but the 2 times he complained about it to Ino, she had merely replied that it wasn't their place to question the Hokage's commands. Naruto blatantly disagreed. Secrets were a dangerous thing in the ninja world, though he didn't say so aloud. Besides, Ino had pointed out, it wasn't like they were the only pair out scouring the land of fire's gambling towns for information. Tenten and Hyuga Neji, Aberrane Shino and Hyuga Hinata, and Shikamaru and Inuzuka Kiba were all out on the same mission, keeping eyes and ears peeled for any sign of movement from any one of a number of Yakuza gangs. He scooted over to where his fellow blonde was holding up the trapdoor that connected the attic to the room below, leaving only a sliver of space to look through. Kneeling down so he could peek through the opening, he inhaled deeply, unsealed the jar, and then blew. Pale yellow gas slowly diffused throughout the room, mixing with the haze of tobacco already pervading it. Within the span of a minute, the occupants' countenances went from wary and businesslike to lethargic, and then asleep. He corked the jar and carefully stood up, lifting back the trapdoor as he did so. Ino took advantage of the opening to cast the Shintention, her body slumping over as her consciousness sailed towards the target down below. Naruto closed the trapdoor and sat down next to his friend's body, enjoying the silence while it lasted. If it wasn't for the fact that he spent more time doing nothing than he did something, the mission wouldn't irk him nearly as much as it did. After all, it was a good test of his stealth and information gathering skills, even if that was more Ino's job, not to mention the efficacy of his poisons as he tweaked them. And finding practical applications for some of the things he learned from Asuma was always a plus. For instance, the method of dispersing the sleeping agent throughout the room wasn't even ninjutsu. It was a breathing exercise Team 10's sensei had taught him as a way of increasing the power and longevity of any futon, or kaiten, not that he knew any techniques he used. One part each mediation and control, practicing it had given him a better and stronger lung capacity, even granting him temporary immunity to wandering through his own gaseous bombs. Best of all, because it didn't use chakra, it was undetectable through conventional ninja sensing means. It was a strategy that had worked well for the 3 weeks they'd been spying on the Yakuza. Jiraiya had specified that everything was to be done discreetly so as to not implicate Konoha in any way, and having Ino root through the memories of the unconscious gangsters was a great way to fulfill such mission parameters. To that end, Naruto had understood why he had been paired with the female blonde in lieu of Shikamaru, though Jiraiya always seemed to have some hidden agenda behind whatever he did. The sound of a door slamming open below drew Naruto's attention. There was a moment of silence in which the blonde presumed that whoever had come in was staring at the sight of the sleeping men before him. Then a voice growled, "Someone beat us here." Naruto frowned to himself. Who else would be interested in the Yakuza? Hurry up, Ino, he thought, glancing at the other blonde. He fidgeted slightly, the potential danger making the quest for seemingly useless information even more aggravating. Quiet. Did you hear that? The blonde froze. I barely moved, no one should have been able to hear that. Well, prompted a second voice. 2 heartbeats, up there, answered the first voice after a moment, and Naruto presumed that this person was pointing directly at the ceiling. Looks like we found some rats. Zankua. Shit. Naruto dove forward in a roll, scooping Ino's body into his arms as a concussive blast of air blew a hole through both the floor and ceiling of the attic. Holding his teammate's body to his chest, the blonde leaped out the hole in the roof, using chakra to jump from building to building. He spared a glance behind him, finding 4 shinobi dressed in gray outfits, black head coverings, and camouflage patterned scarves chasing him. He vaguely recalled seeing similar clothes being worn by a number of the shinobi who had participated in the invasion of Konoha during the Chunin exams. Oto Nin. He wondered, it at least explained how they'd been able to hear him from the barest of noises. Come on, Ino, he thought, scowling at the girl in his arms, wake the hell up already. Then again, maybe it was better that Ino stayed unaware. She'd explained at the start of their mission that, because she'd be using the Yamanaka clan techniques on unconscious opponents, she'd have no awareness of her surroundings. Thus, to prevent any increased disorientation upon returning to her body, it would be better to remain in one place while she did her work, forcing him to act as a bodyguard. Ino wouldn't be pleased to find out they'd had to move, but it was better than one or both of them getting killed. And at least Naruto could retaliate if she could fend for herself. As it was now, his hands were tied. It was another one of those situations where the blonde was forced to weigh his philosophy of self-reliance against both morality and his future self-preservation. If he left Ino to her own devices, he could easily evade the squad of sound shinobi hounding him. It was what Zetsu's teachings preached, anyway. And Naruto could still remember Black Zetsu's dark amusement when his tutor had asked him if his teammates were his friends. Back then, the answer had been a rather emphatic no, given that the other members of Team 7 had been rather antagonistic towards him, but now he was working with Team 10, and Ino was the closest friend the blonde had. To abandon her to her death when they had a working relationship that he actually benefited from felt wrong. Not to mention that doing so would likely put him under increased scrutiny just as he was starting to experience more freedom. Zankua. He jumped right as the blast of air tore through his previous position, shredding a number of branches of the forest they'd entered. Never announce your intentions, he thought, mentally thanking the Oto Nin for their lack of subtlety. It barely helped keep him ahead of their intentions, but unless Ino woke up soon, his hands were still too preoccupied with carrying her to launch a good counteroffensive. Which didn't meant he couldn't stall. Maneuvering his hands to position his palms as close together as possible while still holding his teammate, Naruto used the momentum from his next jump to turn in midair, cheeks puffed out with wind chakra. He exhaled a violent wind palm at his adversaries, hoping that it could serve as a distraction while he figured out what to do. Returning to running forward, he looked down to find Ino's blue eyes flickering open. Naruto. Position was compromised, he explained before she asked, being chased. She lifted her head up to peer over his right shoulder, baby blue eyes widening in surprise. Incoming. Her hand dipped into his kunai pouch and came out with several throwing knives which were immediately tossed at what Naruto could only assume was an incoming assault. Due to the angle he was holding her, Naruto didn't think that most of his friends' well-meaning interceptions would find their marks, and so he dodged right. The motion was ineffective and he was proven correct when he felt the points of two kunai pierce his flesh. From the right, an Oto Nin jumped out of the forest, a tonfa ready to break Ino's head open. Reacting on instinct, the Jinchuriki turned his body so that the weapon's force smashed against his back rather than the Yamanaka. He gritted his teeth against the pain, mule kicking blindly and sending the assailant careening back to where he came from. You saved me, Ino murmured in stunned surprise. Kinda. After all, they still couldn't retaliate effectively against the Oto Nin, and if he tried to put Ino down, their adversaries would surely take advantage of the momentary interruption. In the shinobi world, battles could be and often were decided in seconds. And with him injured, not to mention them being outnumbered, their odds of succeeding in open combat were slim. There was one idea that came to mind, but he wasn't sure if it would work with another person. Then again, he thought, weaving back and forth to make himself a harder target, it wasn't like there were many other options available to them. Stretching his fingers into the cross seal for the cage bunshin, he created a handful of shadow clones that immediately moved to intercept the Oto Nin. With their adversaries effectively distracted, Naruto put his plan into motion, summoning chakra to cover his body. Ino shivered a little as his chakra encompassed her as well, and then, with a hopeful inhale, he stopped, spread some chakra into the ground, and sank into it. Fortunately, the Shinra Bansho activated without a hitch, allowing both blondes to meld seamlessly into the earth. Ino didn't handle the transition nearly as well as he had hoped, practically shrieking, "What the?" before he managed to clap a hand over where he recalled her mouth being. He waited a moment for her to calm down and get used to the darkness of the underground before removing his hand, placing only his pointer finger over her lips in a gesture to keep silent. Just because the attack prevention technique made him undetectable by senses didn't mean that the sound shinobi couldn't hear them. When he felt her nod, Naruto trailed his hand to her shoulder, down the length of her arm, and finally grabbed her hand. Then he folded her fingers into a rough approximation of the ram seal. Ino seemed to understand what he was asking, for she slowly, almost tentatively, crawled out of his arms and began to focus on her sensor abilities. Naruto spread his chakra into the earth around them, granting him the capacity for movement. Then, placing a hand on her shoulder, he allowed her to lead him through the earth, spreading his chakra along their path. Moving around with the Shinra Bansho activated was always an interesting process. There was no real way to see, at least, not in the same sense as regular sight, though there was still a vague sense of direction, orientation, and material he was passing through. It was a small drawback, often requiring a little bit of scouting ahead of the surroundings or experimentation with location, but the flexibility of the technique was still immensely useful. Even more so now that he'd found out he could use it with a second person. And with Ino possessing the sensing abilities that Naruto innately lacked, the Jinchuriki could finally go on the offensive. He withdrew a Kurei-tipped senbon from his sleeve when Ino stopped suddenly, assuming that one of the Oto Nin was directly above them. The blonde surfaced slowly, allowing only his face and hand to appear above ground. He immediately stabbed into the ankle of the Oto Nin beside him, then, in a move oddly reminiscent of Zetsu, slipped back underground before the other shinobi could react. When he and Ino were back on the same level, he tapped her shoulder and gestured ahead, silently indicating for them to move on to the next target. By the time Ino had guided him into sneakily poisoning 2 of the remaining 3 Oto Nin, Naruto could feel his movements growing sluggish from blood loss and fatigue. Still, he considered, following his fellow blonde through the earth, he had to admit that what he was accomplishing was well suited to the style he'd imagined. Even if he didn't want to actually serve as one of the Leaf's Anbu agents, his stealth, poisons, and general avoidance of conflict was working to a T. The surprise factor that he'd banked on against Gaara during the invasion was a powerful element that he could rely on, especially with the Shinra Bansho in his arsenal. He chose to ignore the fact that it was currently only possible with Ino's assistance, and instead focused on his teammates' direction towards where the last sound shinobi was waiting. Senbon in hand, he slowly released the attack prevention technique and moved to stab into the enemy's ankle. Something clasped around his wrist, hard. It tugged, and Naruto found himself plucked from the ground like a turnip. He stared into the masked visage of the last Oto Nin, the man he guessed to be the leader. "You're not as quiet as you think you are," he sneered in a dangerous tone, "even if you were able to kill all my men." Naruto grabbed the man's arm with his other hand and began to swing, using the limb as leverage to plant both feet firmly into the Oto Nin's chest. The older male grunted at the impact but didn't relinquish his hold on the blonde, instead tightening his grip even further. "Don't think I'm letting go. You need to touch the ground to disappear, and that's not going to happen." The tip of some bladed weapon poked out from the Oto Nin's sleeve. "Now die." Naruto saw the metal flash forward, the tip aimed for his throat. With his death seemingly imminent, his body felt frozen with some unknown sensation, fear, probably, some distant corner of his brain provided, and his mind was filled with static. It was almost ironic how, in the moment where he needed to react the most, he couldn't remember even his most basic skills in order to survive. With the ghastly specter of death looming in front of him, all of his accomplishments up until that point seemed meaningless, his dreams for the future disintegrating to dust. He blinked, and in the moment it took for him to realize he could blink, he became aware of the Oto Nin's blade beside, not through, his neck. A tiny rivulet of blood dribbled into his shirt from where the edge had thinly sliced into his neck. Naruto. He tilted his head at the noise, finding Ino panting behind him with her fingers held in some clan-specific hand sign. Her baby blue eyes were wide with fear and desperation. His brain suddenly kicked into overdrive, and Naruto took his enemy's temporary moment of inaction to lash out with his leg, this time aiming for the man's groin. The sound shinobi apparently didn't have the wherewithal to suffer that injury and maintain his grip on Naruto, and the blonde landed in a crouch. In a single, fluid motion, he withdrew his hunting knives from where they were strapped against his forearms, hidden by his sleeves, and buried them in the Oto Nin's chest. He stepped aside as the man fell backwards, assured that if the wounds didn't kill him, the poison certainly would. He slumped to the ground with a relieved sigh as Ino approached warily. "Is he?" Naruto nodded. "Or he will be soon enough," he amended. Then he glanced up at her with curious blue eyes. "You saved me." "Of course I did, you idiot," she chastised. "When you didn't come back down right away, I got worried, so I came up. Besides," Ino continued quietly, "you saved me first." The female blonde hesitated before prompting, let me see. With a reluctant sigh, Naruto shed his two shirts and tossed them to the ground, exposing his battered back to his friend. Instead of berating him like he expected, or even beginning to use his ointment like she usually did, Ino began to trace the kunai wounds with a finger. Naruto withheld the shudder that ran down his spine as she did so, an event he had no explanation for, but couldn't bite back the flinch when she touched a bit too close to the massive bruise the tonfa had left. Sorry, she told him quickly. You got all these injuries protecting me. She sounded so surprised at the notion that Naruto wondered if it was a reflection of how injured he was or whether she believed he wouldn't actually try to save her life. The latter thought was disturbing, if only because its veracity meant that he would have to work on being more outwardly capable of expressing concern for his teammates, another conundrum to ponder. It's not a big deal, he assured her. Just patch me up like usual and I'll be good as new soon enough. Ino remained oddly silent as she gently, more so than normal, he noticed, cleaned his wounds and then rubbed his different salves over the bruising and kunai punctures. She walked around him with a roll of bandages as he held his arms up, finally declaring him fit for travel in a subdued voice. Naruto groaned a little as he stood, stretching his back gingerly to not antagonize his wounds. He moved to stand next to the dead Otonin and towed the corpse for any reaction. There was none. Kneeling down, he pulled out his hunting knives and resheathed them before throwing on his shirts again. We're done here, he told Ino. She looked about ready to protest continuing their journey back to Konoha until he was healed, but then she swallowed whatever she was going to say. Right, she agreed, though her baby blue eyes remained troubled. That look, guilt, Naruto guessed, stayed in the back of his mind all the way to Konoha. Ino's stubbornness mixed with guilt and or worry was bound to have some sort of repercussions for him. LLL. And that's what happened, Hokage-sama. Well, sounds like you two had quite the adventure, Jiraiya said. Is there anything else to report? What was the point of this mission? Naruto interjected, speaking for the first time since having to tell the Sannin about the encounter with the Sound Shinobi. Despite Ino being unconscious for part of it, she'd revealed his usage of the Shinra Bansho after sparing him a brief apologetic glance for having to betray his confidence, and his sour mood had turned even dourer upon having to reveal the main trick he'd been hiding from his teacher. Jiraiya stared at him for several seconds before, without removing his gaze, saying, "You're dismissed, Yamanaka-chan." She hesitated briefly before bowing to him, shooting a look of concern over her shoulder at her fellow blonde as she left the room. When she was gone, Jiraiya heaved a sigh and rubbed his forehead with one hand. He stood up and looked out the giant window behind his desk, hands clasped behind his back. Do you know who runs Otogakure? Some important guy, the blonde answered, his irritation seeping through as sarcasm. The Toad Sannin turned around and gave him a flat look. Orochimaru. Naruto blinked, he hadn't been expecting that. Like, your ex-teammate. That Orochimaru. The very same. Jiraiya retook his seat and gestured for Naruto to do the same. The blonde complied, grateful to rest his aching back against a soft chair. Remember when I went to find Tsunade? Yeah. Well, Orochimaru was also looking for her. Sarutobi-sensei damaged his arms pretty badly in their fight, and only a medic of Tsunade's caliber could possibly have any chance of healing him, he explained when Naruto opened his mouth to ask why. Anyway, we got into a rather heated fight over who Tsunade should place her loyalties with, and, let's just say it didn't end well. When Jiraiya didn't immediately continue, Naruto prompted, what does that have to do with this? The white-haired man sighed. I'm getting to that, if you'd stop interrupting. Now, if there's one thing Tsunade is good at, it's running away, so obviously she got away. But she has a compulsion, he settled on after a moment of indecision, which gets her into trouble sometimes. See, Tsunade's a notoriously bad gambler, so bad, in fact, that most people know her as the legendary sucker. That was, well, almost funny, if Naruto was honest with himself. To stick so ardently to her passion, no matter how poor she was at it, that she was known more for that in modern times than for her status as a member of the Sannin or her contributions as a legendary medic nin spoke volumes about her stubbornness. Aha! Jiraiya got up and started pacing, hands linked behind his back. Unfortunately, she's also bad at paying back the debts she owes, and while that normally isn't a problem, there's other issues. Orochimaru, mainly. He's trying to find her. Or worse, Jiraiya scowled. Orochimaru's always been very covert and reclusive in his activities. When we were kids, he was never willing to confide anything in Tsunade and me, but he was so gifted at the shinobi arts that he was Sarutobi-sensei's favorite pupil. I used to think he never took any time out to do anything fun, always studying or practicing, coming up with new and strange techniques. He shook his head and heaved a weary sigh. I considered him my friend because we were on the same team and we grew up together, but I don't think Orochimaru ever looked at Tsunade and me the same way. Naruto tried to repress the shiver of apprehension that ran down his spine at the turn the conversation had taken. He didn't know much about Orochimaru personally, only about some of his exploits during his time as a loyal Konoha nin working alongside his two teammates, but Jiraiya, knowingly or not, was drawing a lot of parallels between the traitorous Sannin and himself. Reclusive, lacking friends, more interested in perfecting their shinobi lifestyles than forming any personal connections, the similarities kept stacking up. And while that spoke well of the potential strength Naruto could achieve, it also hinted towards a very unstable psyche in the future. Assuming, of course, that he hadn't already cracked at some point during Zetsu's lessons. Orochimaru's got a pretty twisted sense of morals, continued the Hokage, mirroring the blonde's thoughts. He has no compulsion about murdering children, betraying an alliance, or anything else so long as it benefits him. Some of the experiments he performed on members of the village, kid, pray that you never have to see anything as gruesome as those. Experimental, Naruto thought morosely, chalking up another shared characteristic between himself and the snake Sannin. No wonder Jiraiya's always trying to keep an eye on me. Anyway, you can see why Tsunade needs to come back. When Naruto's expression conveyed nothing but blank incomprehension, Jiraiya reseated himself with a sigh and explained, I received a tip that the Yakuza are getting antsy at her gambling hiatus. Apparently they're trying to come up with some way of getting their money from Tsunade. The pieces of the puzzle suddenly clicked together. We were gathering intel on Tsunade, the blonde realized. Jiraiya smirked. Running my spy network is a bit more difficult now that I'm stuck behind this desk, incapable of roaming around. That's where you guys come in. Naruto was quiet at that revelation, his thoughts racing to try and connect all the dots. Jiraiya was using them, him, Ino, Neji, Tenten, Hinata, Shino, Kiba, and Shikamaru, as his new spy network, or at least as an extension of his current one, gathering information from places he could no longer go because of the duty he'd been forced to take. And because he was the acting Hokage and they were his loyal foot soldiers, they had no choice but to comply with whatever demands he asked of them. It was annoying, and clever, and just a tad vengeful, if put into the perspective that Jiraiya had become Hokage because Naruto had refused to go with him to find Tsunade. Man, that's convoluted. Jiraiya's voice interrupted the blonde's musing. She needs to come back to Konoha. But she already told you she wasn't gonna become Hokage, the blonde protested. I know, the Sannin waved off carelessly, and it's not for that. Her coming back will serve two purposes. One, he began, holding up a finger, it'll keep her safe from the likes of the Yakuza and, more importantly, Orochimaru. How altruistic of you, Naruto considered facetiously, using a word Zetsu had often used to describe leaf shinobi. 2. Jiraiya continued, unaware of his student's internal cynicism, I plan on implementing Tsunade's idea for combat medical shinobi, as well as restructuring the hospital's personnel infrastructure. But medical know-how is a bit outside my admittedly grandiose expertise, which is why she needs to return. You're free to use any means to do so, but keep in mind that she is a Sannin. Naruto started at that. Wait, what? His white-haired teacher smirked at him. Oh, did I not mention? You're gonna be the one to get her to come back. Better get yourself checked out at the hospital, you're leaving the day after tomorrow. Naruto bowed jerkily to hide his grimace. It seemed that despite his attempts to avoid indulging Jiraiya's desire for him to meet Tsunade, they were destined to have a confrontation anyway. Yes, Hokage-sama, he offered with forced politeness before turning and heading for the door. Still, despite the upcoming mission, the blonde breathed a silent sigh of relief. In all the confusion, Jiraiya hadn't asked him anything about the Shinra Bansho. Oh, and Naruto. The Jinchuriki froze in his steps and almost mechanically turned to face his sometimes teacher. Every shinobi has a technique or two that they like to keep hidden, Jiraiya said, but for the sake of the missions you take and your teammates' lives, let's have full disclosure in the future, As you say, Hokage-sama. LLL. Go away, kid, I'm busy. Naruto managed to hold back his irritation at being dismissed so easily. Judging by the low growl coming from behind him, Kiba did not have the same restraint. Hey, listen, was all he managed before a soft smack of flesh on flesh cut him off. The blonde glanced behind him to find Shino's hand clapped over the Inuzuka's mouth. He gave a curt nod of appreciation to the Aburame, who returned the gesture. The mission was going to be hard enough without Kiba making a bad first impression by opening his mouth. Somehow, and Naruto wasn't sure whether to consider it luck or not, the squad consisting of him and the 3 members of Team 8 had managed to locate Tsunade within 2 days of setting out from Konoha. All things considered, it probably wasn't as big a feat as the blonde was making it out to be. Jiraiya had compiled all the data from his new spy network, and the idea that he'd been ignorant to such manipulation still rankled slightly, and concluded that only 2 Yakuza clans were ambivalent regarding trying to settle things with Tsunade. That, he had said, pointed to them colluding with the Slug Sannin, which meant that whatever towns they ran were most likely the ones where Tsunade was taking refuge, and gambling. So he deployed Naruto and the trackers of Team 8 to find and bring her back to the Hidden Leaf. Fate had seemed to be shining on them when they'd found Tsunade playing blackjack at the first casino of the first of the 2 towns on their journey, though Naruto didn't really consider it fortunate to have run into her so soon, as he only had a partial idea of how to convince her to return to Konoha. Because therein lied the problem, the same one that he'd come up with when Jiraiya had originally proposed the same crazy journey months and months ago. Tsunade didn't want to return to Konoha. Unless she'd suffered some sort of traumatic brain injury between the time she and her teammates had reunited and now, the result was practically guaranteed to be the same as when Jiraiya had gone searching for her. And how was he supposed to convince her to come back with them when the words Jiraiya wanted him to spew were ones he didn't even believe in himself? He sighed to himself before saying, "It would only take a couple minutes, Tsunade-sama. Better to be polite to one of the strongest kunoichi Konoha had ever produced than risk her dismissing him outright for impudence." Honey-colored eyes flickered over the quartet of children, focusing momentarily on Kiba's tattoos, Shino's high collar and sunglasses, Hinata's Byakugan, and then the Jinchuriki's own Hatei 8. "I already told Jiraiya that I wasn't going to become the Godime Hokage," she said, turning back to the dealer. "Hit me." The dealer laid down a card and pronounced, 21. He measured out a stack of chips equal to Tsunade's wager and swept the cards from the table. Tsunade stared at the pile of chips for a moment before standing up. "Shizune, we're leaving." "All right, Tsunade-sama," the dark-haired woman standing behind her managed in surprise. She scooped up the chips and hurried after the Sannin, a pig tottering after the pair. "Naruto-san. Yeah, I know. Let's go." They tailed Tsunade and Shizune out the gambling parlor and down the street, not bothering to keep their intentions covered. The thing about following an S-class shinobi the likes of the Slug Sannin was that trying to remain subtle was a pointless endeavor. If the reputation Tsunade had did in fact precede her, then she would know they were there regardless of how they tried to disguise themselves. It took a surprisingly long time, almost 10 minutes, before Tsunade whirled around, face contorted with irritation. "I thought I told you brats to go away. Technically, Tsunade-sama, you only stated that you had already told Jiraiya-sama you were uninterested in the Hokage position." The blonde Sannin narrowed her eyes at Shino's bland refute of her claim. The dismissal was implied. "Now, go away." "Hey, no can do, lady. We've got a mission to complete. Kiba-kun, you should be more respectful to Tsunade-sama." Naruto turned around just as Kiba opened his mouth to retort to his teammate, shooting the 3 members of Team 8 a look that told them to be quiet. The dog Nin immediately closed his mouth, though he looked sour at doing so. Naruto returned his focus to the wayward Sannin. "We're not here to ask you to be the Hokage, Tsunade-sama," the blonde placated calmly. "If you didn't know, Jiraiya is now the Godime." Tsunade's expression changed to something unreadable for a moment, a brief flash of something Naruto thought might be sorrow crossing her features before disappearing behind a mask of stoicism. "So, the old pervert took the job, huh? That's a surprise." Naruto remained quiet as Tsunade became pensive, lost in her memories. He waited patiently for an appropriate moment to interject, used to Jiraiya falling into the same sort of moods. After several moments, he said, "Tsunade-sama, we'd like you to accompany us to Konoha." Jiraiya wants to see you. The blonde Sanin snorted. I'll bet he does. Probably wants to say goodbye before he gets himself killed like all the other Hokage. Behind him, Hinata inhaled sharply and Kiba let out a low growl. Even Shizune let out a gasp, Tsunade-sama. At the blonde's disrespect for the position. Naruto tried his best to ignore them. The third had made it his duty to get close to everyone in the village, and both Hinata and Kiba were sentimental enough to let Tsunade's words bother them, and Shizune seemed formal enough to care about that kind of thing. He was neither. Everybody dies, he returned calmly, which is something I didn't think I'd have to explain to you. Tsunade's honey-colored eyes widened for an instant before anger overtook her fair features. She cracked her knuckles threateningly and made to take a step towards the younger blonde. But that's why Jiraiya wants you to come back. He wants to start the medic nin program you suggested and have you lead it. Some of the older woman's rage faded away, a contemplative expression settling on her face in its place. Naruto awaited her reply with bated breath, hoping that his gamble would pay off. This idea, dangling Tsunade's long-sought dream before her, was the only argument the Jinchuriki could come up with that would stand any chance of working. Tsunade's disdain for the Hokage position, soaked with the blood of her family and lover, was a poor topic to seek understanding from. But everybody had dreams of their own, goals they wanted to achieve and see come to fruition. Jiraiya had told him long ago that the medic program had been Tsunade's way of reconciling her brother's death, but wartime had prevented the program's initiation. Now, with the world in a state of tentative peace and her former teammate actively seeking its implementation, she had no reason to reject the dream just within her grasp. HMPH. Tsunade walked up to Naruto and leaned down slightly to stare him in the eyes. The shorter blonde stared back, ignoring the slug Sanin's ample bosom in his attempt to pass whatever test she was imposing upon him. Tell the old perv, she stated at length, carefully drawing out her words, that he's 30 years too late. Then she turned and walked away. Naruto watched her go, an expression of shock twisting itself over his carefully composed features. That had been his only hook, the only chance he had of peaceably bringing the wayward Sanin back to the hidden leaf with him, and she'd taken a bite only to spit it right back in his face. The stupid part was that Tsunade's decision made no logical sense. Back when he'd been more naive, he would have done just about anything to make his dream of becoming Hokage a reality. It had been the air he'd breathed, the food he'd eaten, the very reason he'd woken up in the mornings and fought for some shred of acknowledgement in a village that found him, at best, a nuisance. And now, with a goal that seemed just as out of reach, if only because he was going against the grain of what the shinobi profession dictated, to hear Tsunade pass on an achievement that she'd been waiting to come to fruition for decades, it both surprised and pissed him off. By brushing off the opportunity to realize her own dream, the older blonde was practically dismissing the efforts of everyone who fought for what they believed in. Being trapped in one's own personal nightmare, Naruto was already experiencing it and he wanted out. When he'd stared death in the face only a couple days previously and thought that he'd never see his dreams realized, he'd momentarily despaired at his failure. To be given the chance to escape and to so flatly refuse it was like a slap in the face. His expression hardened from dumbstruck to determined as Tsunade left them behind, her assistant glancing at the group one last time before following her mentor. If the slug Sanin wanted to stagnate in her own horrors, then she was welcome to do so. But Naruto would make sure that her suffering would occur within Konoha's great walls. LLL. Due to their clientele, the Yakuza actually had some decent security for their hotels. Most ninja were paranoid by nature, and thus had the propensity to rely on their own tricks, sensing, seals, Tenten-like to booby-trap her apartment, but the families still employed their own alarms and security to make sure their customers were offered some form of protection. The ones that were better off monetarily could even hire ninja of their own to create stronger sensory and detection seals for their higher-paying clients. Not that any of that mattered when one had the ability to walk through walls, but Naruto could appreciate the effort put in to keep the gamblers safe. It was nearing 2 a.m. when the topmost part of one of the walls in room 514 began to undulate from some unseen force. Within the next several seconds, Naruto's face could be seen by only the most trained eyes. Blue eyes strained to become adjusted to the darkened space, the curtains drawn to protest the shine of the waxing moon. That was fine with the blonde, though, he hadn't trained with Tenten simply to be foiled by limited visibility. Targets are still asleep, en Naruto-kun. Naruto nodded just slightly, knowing that Hinata could see the gesture from where his teammates were surveying the scene to the best of their abilities. He hadn't thought much of the radios Jiraiya had given him before they'd left the Hidden Leaf, but then again, he hadn't given his team much thought either. Having Team 8 around was, surprisingly, a great boon. While the Jinchuriki was more used to dealing with Ino's sensory abilities and personality, he had to admit that Hinata, Kiba, and Shino put his fellow blondes' tracking abilities to shame. With the Inuzuka's nose, the Hyuga's eyes, and the Abarame's pheromone-scenting insects, finding out Tsunade's exact location had been a breeze. Which left the most dangerous part of the job to him. Silently, while still merged with the wall, he reached into his pocket and withdrew the object within. The blowpipe stuck out almost comically from the wall, though the small dart he'd loaded it with was anything but a laughing matter. The wooden instrument had been Tenten's suggestion upon Naruto's query for some sort of weapon that would work similarly to his senbon, but also be usable in lieu of the throwing motion. He'd adjusted to it surprisingly quickly, finding the narrow tube easier to aim than the inconsistency of his own arm, and the darts it used were smaller and less traceable than the comparatively large needles. It wasn't overly useful in straight-up combat, but then again, Naruto didn't plan on using it for that. Tsunade's the bigger threat. With that thought in mind, he took careful aim and blew on the blowpipe, hard enough for the dart to be ejected, but soft enough so that the action was mostly silent. It struck the older blonde just below the neck, an easy target due to her low-cut top, where the sedative poisoning the tip would quickly disperse throughout her body. Tsunade was probably the world's greatest medical ninja, but even she couldn't cure anything if she wasn't conscious. As quickly and quietly as possible, he reloaded the blowpipe and marked out the sleeping forms of both Shizune and the pig dozing on the floor beside her, knocking them out with another 2 darts. His task taken care of, Naruto melded back into the wall with the Shinra Bansho, making his way to the outside and jumping down to meet his teammates assembled on the ground below. It's done. Most impressive, Shino noted, though I doubt Jiraiya-sama intended this as an outcome when he assigned us this mission. Lighten up, Shino, Kiba said. We did it, didn't we? I think that's saying something, especially since Naruto was the one in charge. And Naruto-kun is a good leader, Kiba-kun, Hinata asserted softly. The Inuzuka waved off her words. Yeah, whatever. So, Teiko, he continued, putting a mocking emphasis on the title, now what? Naruto resisted the urge to sigh. Just because Team 8 was useful didn't mean the members didn't have their own little quirks which irritated him. I kinda miss Ino, and since they'd have to bodily carry Tsunade, Shizune, and the pig back to Konoha with them, all the while keeping them sedated. This time, the blonde did sigh aloud. The journey ahead would be an annoyingly long one. LLL. That will be all for this video. Be sure to like, subscribe, share, and comment down below for more videos. Goodbye.